All righty. So we finally made it to the Neanderthals. So this is going to be a long lecture in multiple parts because there's a lot to talk about with the Neanderthals because we know so much about them. They're pretty famous because, as I mentioned, like way back in Module 1, the Neanderthals are the kind of original hominin in terms of like scientific discovery. Other than us, Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals were the first hominin species that we ever found. And because of that, we not only have a lot of information about them, but there's also a lot of cultural myths around them. And there's been a lot of conversations in scientific circles, in kind of pop culture, about who the Neanderthals even are and who they were. So the common pop culture perception of the Neanderthals were kind of these like primitive, semi-erect, stupid cave dwellers that, were unevolved. And we tend to use the term Neanderthal to refer to somebody who's being unevolved, who's like acting in a bad way, right? Like you're like, stop being like such a Neanderthal, right? Um, and that is a myth that still perpetuates today. But as we're going to find out over the next few lectures here, is that the Neanderthals were not like that at all, and that the Neanderthals were actually very intelligent, highly evolved, with complex cultural traits, and that as we find more and more information about the Neanderthals, we're actually finding that they weren't just funny looking modern humans like the stereotypical caveman that we find, but are actually highly evolved and highly advanced species that were pretty much just as intelligent as we Homo sapiens are. Um, Now, to get into the discovery again, because we only mentioned them very briefly back in Module 1, the holotype for the Neanderthals were found in 1856 in an area called Neander Valley in Germany. The holotype is the type specimen, meaning that it's the original specimen. It's the one that Neanderthals were named after. And when you have a holotype, what you do is you save that holotype, and then any other fossils that you find, you compare it to that holotype. And if it looks like the holotype, then it's a Neanderthal. And if it doesn't look like the holotype, then it's not a Neanderthal. And every species we've talked about in this class, every species that we will talk about in this class, does have a type specimen. It does have a holotype. And if it doesn't match the holotype, then you found a new species and you get to name the new species and do all that cool stuff. Now, when the holotype for the Neanderthals were originally found, it was originally believed to be a pathological human. It was originally thought to be like, wow, this is a Homo sapien that's kind of messed up. And the reason for that is that you have to remember 1856 was before Darwin's Origin of Species popularized natural selection and different theories of evolution. 1856 was before we really had a good understanding of the immense time depth of planet Earth. So there's so much going on here that we really we didn't have a lot of information for. So thinking of it as like another hominin species, another species in our evolutionary lineage, was kind of like not even on people's radar until more analysis was done and more fossils were found. Um, the first person to really propose that, hey, this is not just a pathological human, but is actually a brand new species, was a scientist by the name of Gregory King. And he was the one who came up with the name Homo neanderthalensis. Neanderthalensis coming from the place where it was found, Neander Valley, and Homo because it looked like us, so it's obviously part of our genus. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about pronunciation and spelling. So whenever you probably have heard the term in the past, you probably heard or used the term Neanderthal. That is actually incorrect. Um, it used to be correct, but it is now incorrect. And the reason is some changes in the German language and some changes that we've made to reflect that German pronunciation. So when we use the species name, we do say Homo neanderthalensis with that the sound, that th the sound in the middle. And you pronounce the species name Homo neanderthalensis like that. And this is because the old German word for valley was Thal. So Neander Valley was Neanderthal. And so we use that because the species name Homo neanderthalensis was created back when this old German term was still in play. However, German has changed the spelling of thal so that it's just tall. So in New German, Neander Valley is Neanderthal. So when you pronounce the common name Neanderthal, you say it with a hard T sound and you do not spell it with an H. It is a hard T, Neanderthal. And so when you're writing in this class and when you're speaking about things in this class, I want you to do this appropriately. Meaning, I want to see Neanderthal written out without the H. But when you write out Homo neanderthalensis, keep the H in there because, as we've talked about before, you're not allowed to change species names. So because the original species in binomial nomenclature was Homo neanderthalensis, we keep that even though German has changed the spelling of the word thal to tall. Right? So don't say Neanderthal. Don't spell it Neanderthal. Say Neanderthal and spell it without the H, unless you're saying the binomial nomenclature term Homo neanderthalensis. Then you pronounce it with the th and you keep the H in there. Because again, species names aren't allowed to change due to the rules of taxonomy. So where did Neanderthals live? Well, we find Neanderthals in Europe and in Southwest Asia. This map is the best I could find, but the map is also really shittily designed. The black is land, the teaked areas are water. So, and then the white line is where we find Neanderthals. So we find them a lot in Europe and then into the Arabian Peninsula and into Southwest Asia. And they have such a wide range, mostly because it's the Ice Age. And as we've talked about before, during the Ice Age, there were glacial periods and also interglacial periods. So during the interglacials, Europe was relatively warm and the glaciers receded up north. So you can move into kind of northern Germany, into like what we think of today as like Denmark and things like that. And then when the glaciers hit during the glacial periods, you were pushed south. And so Southern Europe and Southwest Asia here became what we call refugia, or places where you would find refuge during these intense glacial cold periods. So they would get pushed back into Southwest Asia, and then they would move back up into Northern Europe when they were able to. So between Europe and Southwest Asia, we have a lot of really important Neanderthal sites. One of those is in Belgium in the site of Spee. And this we found two Neanderthal skeletons in the 1870s. And this was a really important find because these Neanderthal specimens were found with the remains of extinct animals. And this was the first site that really gave us that evidence that said, you know what? These Neanderthals, they're not just pathological humans, but they're old. They are extinct humans because they're with these very old extinct animals. Wow, just really messed it up. Animals. And this really became the death knell of the pathology hypothesis. Another really important site is in Croatia. It's called Krapina. It's one of the sites in red you can see over there on Eastern Europe. This was originally excavated in 1899 and gave us a ton of new Neanderthal specimens to study. Over 800 different fossils were found here at the site of Krapina, including crania, mandibles, postcrania, over 180 teeth, and was really helpful because when you have a lot of specimens like this, you really get to get a good understanding of what the variation in the anatomy of a single species is. And we've talked before about splitters and lumpers and Homo habilis versus Homo rudolfensis and Homo ergaster versus Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis versus Homo rhodesiensis. And part of that debate is that sometimes we don't really know, when we only have a few specimens, how much variation actually existed in that single species. When we have 800 specimens coming from just one site, and on this map, you can see all of the different Neanderthal sites in Europe, it really helps us figure that out. Another really important site for the Neanderthals is La Ferracie. This was excavated in 1907. Again, it's listed in red there in southern France. Here we get 8 individuals, including infants and children. And we'll talk about this later, but La Ferracie is going to be the best evidence that we have that Neanderthals actually deliberately buried their dead, which is an example of a complex cultural behavior that really changed our perspective on Neanderthals and showed us that they weren't just unevolved cave people, but were actually just as intelligent and had just as complex culture as we do. There's also Zafaria in Spain. This one is on the map. It's very far southern Spain in the red text. This was a more recent discovery in 1980. We found a nearly complete 1980, a nearly complete mandible here in 1980, dating to around 30,000 years ago, and might even be as young as 21,000 years ago, and represents some of the most recent Neanderthal material. So it really helps us figure out how the Neanderthals went extinct, which we will talk about later. Moving into Southwest Asia, some of the sites down here, one of those is Shanidar Cave in Iraq, which you can see on the slide in red. Here, 10 individuals were found, including several adults and children. This is also going to be another site that gives us really clear evidence that the Neanderthals had complex symbolic and religious behavior because of the flower burial that we will talk about later. Another really cool find from Shanidar Cave comes from an elderly individual, Shanidar 1, and the bone that you see, the long bone there, is actually a humerus, so the upper arm bone. And I know that it's hard to tell, but that's actually doesn't look like a humerus because that humerus actually atrophied. Meaning that the person lost their arm, and then at least the lower part of their arm, and then the upper arm bone healed from whatever traumatic event that they experienced that caused them to lose the lower part of their arm. Because it shows healing, this is actually a really good example of Neanderthals caring for their elderly, caring for their sick, which again shows their intelligence, their empathy, and their complex cultural behaviors. All of these sites, plus the numerous other sites we have found that have Neanderthal specimens, mean that over today we have more than 200 individuals represented. That is a minimum number of individuals. Remember going back to that human osteology lab? But it's probably closer to 500 individuals represented. The thing is that sometimes we have a left humerus and a right humerus, and we don't know if that was from the same individual or not. So at minimum, we have 200 individuals represented in the fossil collection, probably closer to 500. Most are not complete skeletons. Only about 20 of them are fully complete skeletons, but a lot of them are isolated bone and tooth fragments. But this is a much more extensive fossil record than we have than any other really hominid species other than ourselves, Homo sapiens. Now, you might be asking, we have some found in Europe, we have some found in Southwest Asia. Are they the same or are they different? They're pretty similar. They're definitely the same species. There are some anatomical variations, meaning that the European ones look more Neanderthal than the Southwest Neanderthal specimens. Mostly because the European specimens were found in Europe and not Southwest Asia. And Europe was colder and more brutal in terms of climate. So when you think of a Neanderthal, and we're later in this module as we continue to talk about the Neanderthals, a lot of what I'm describing are the European ones. The Southwest Asian ones also look very similar, but in a more relaxed way because they're living in a more temperate climate, in a more mild climate. And so there's not as much selective pressure to select for a lot of the intense Neanderthal traits we'll be talking about later. But for all intents and purposes, you can think of all the Neanderthals looking very, very similar. So I'm going to wrap up this first intro to the Neanderthal part here. When we come back in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to start by asking, where did the Neanderthals come from? What is their evolutionary phylogeny?